Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 276 is a little less than 2 weeks away. It's not this Saturday, it's the following Saturday. And on paper, UFC 276 may be the greatest UFC pay-per-view of all time. Obviously, whether the fights are exciting or not, that remains to be seen. But just looking through the card, there is so many interesting high-level fights, and I cannot wait for UFC 276. So I wanted to make a video. I've done this for the past few pay-per-views. I'm going to look through the entire card of UFC 276, talk about the notable fights, and then at the end of the video, I'm going to give UFC 276 a grade. Now, before I even get into talking about any of the fights or giving it a grade, I put the link for the Tapology page for UFC 276 down in the description. I want you to click on that. Go look at the full card for UFC 276, and before you even watch the rest of the video, comment down below and let me know what is your grade for UFC 276. I'm genuinely curious. And also, guys, if you would do me a favor and like the video, I would greatly appreciate it. So starting off with the main event, you have Israel Adesanya versus Jared Cannonier. And this is a great fight. You have Jared Cannonier coming in off that win, that brutal KO win over Derek Brunson. He's on a 2-fight win streak. He defeated Kelvin Gastelum, and then he destroyed Derek Brunson back at UFC 271 earlier this year. You have Adesanya, who has looked invincible at middleweight. I mean, his last fight with Robert Whittaker in February was kind of close, and it wasn't super eventful. But Adesanya has only ever lost to Jan Blachowicz at light heavyweight. That is saying something. And I know a lot of people have kind of turned on Israel Adesanya in his last few fights. The Marvin Vettori fight wasn't that exciting. The Robert Whittaker fight that wasn't that exciting either. The Jan Blachowicz fight was exciting, but he lost. And, you know, a lot of people didn't expect that. And it wasn't the typical flashy Israel Adesanya, where before you had him brutalizing Paulo Costa. Before that, you had the KO of Robert Whittaker. And then in between there, you had that terrible fight against Joel Romero as well. So Israel Adesanya has lost a little bit of respect because he's had quite a few boring fights, but this guy is one of the most elite strikers of all time. He has great takedown defense, and you have Jared Cannonier coming in who just throws nuclear power in everything he throws. He's a former heavyweight. The guy has decent grappling. He has decent striking. He's just a very well-rounded fighter with a lot of power. I mean, it's hard to believe this guy was a former heavyweight. He fought at heavyweight. He's now fighting at middleweight. He is jacked. He's coming in, you know, and one knock on this main event for me personally is when I look at Israel Adesanya's fight style, his footwork, his elite level striking, I feel like Jared Cannonier is a matchup that can really be easy for Adesanya because it's kind of similar to the Paulo Costa matchup, just Cannonier has a little bit more power because Cannonier doesn't have the best footwork. He kind of plots forward. He looks, you know, to chop your legs, looks to land big shots, and Adesanya just has nice technical striking, and it's kind of going to be hard for Cannonier to track him down, but I still think this is a compelling fight. Cannonier is the most deserving contender, and he does have that knockout power. You cannot count Jared Cannonier out. It's a solid main event. It's for the middleweight title. Can you imagine if Jared Cannonier is able to upset Israel Adesanya? That would be absolutely insane. And I think there's a slight chance he could pull it off. But again, that's one knock on this main event is I don't know how competitive it's going to be. You know, when you look at a fight and you're saying, well, the only path to victory for this guy is to knock him out, it's, you know, it's just a puncher's chance at that point. But I think Cannonier's going to come in more motivated than ever, in the best shape of his life. And I know one thing about Jared Cannonier. He is going to try to take Israel Adesanya's head off. Now, whether he's able to track him down with the footwork and the technical striking of Adesanya, I don't know. But I'm still very interested in this fight. Moving down the card, you have Alexander Volkanovski versus Max Hollway 3. I mean, who doesn't want to see this fight? They've had two borderline controversial fights. I think the first one was clear-cut for Alexander Volkanovski. I think the second one was very close, could have went either way. I scored it for Volkanovski. But this is a great fight because I think it's must-win for both guys. If Alexander Volkanovski loses this fight to Max Hollway, I don't know if the UFC is willing to book it for a fourth time. And that, you know, and that's the same thing for Max Holloway, especially because Max Holloway, if he loses this fight, he's now lost 3 fights to Alexander Volkanovski, and he's not getting a fourth fight for sure. No matter how close it is, he's going to have to change weight classes. So it is do or die in the featherweight division for Max Holloway. Both these guys are the elite of the elite at featherweight. Volkanovski is coming off those brutal beatdowns of the Korean Zombie and Brian Ortega. Ortega. And I know, the Brian Ortega fight, people were talking about that fight saying, oh, it's one of the greatest fights of the year. That was a one-sided beatdown with Brian Ortega getting 2 close submission attempts in the 3rd round, which made the fight so compelling. But Volkanovski outclassed both Brian Ortega and the Korean Zombie. I didn't really think the Korean Zombie belonged in there. Max Hollway couldn't make that date because of an injury. The UFC kind of jumped the gun. They booked the Korean Zombie. Then Max Hollway came out and said, oh, I could have made that date. So it was kind of, it was kind of annoying to me because I would have rather them just postpone the fight and do Volkanovski versus Max Holloway, because I just want to see some finality to this trilogy. There's a lot of people claiming Max Holloway is the uncrowned champ and Volkanovski's been out there just dishing out beatings. I'm happy that we're finally getting to see them fight each other for the 3rd time. And it's not like Max Holloway just sat around and cried in the meantime. He beat the brakes off of Calvin Kattar, and he had a competitive fight that he clearly won against Yair Rodriguez. So he beat 2 top contenders, and now he's getting his trilogy fight against Alexander Volkanovski. And I really think Max Holloway has to win this fight. There's got to be so much pressure on him, because if he loses this fight, Max Holloway is going to have to move up to 155 or just wait around praying that someone beats Alexander Volkanovski, or hope that Volkanovski changes weight class, because he's not getting a 4th shot against Volkanovski. And then he's in a weird spot, because if he can't beat the champion, you don't want to have him knocking off all the contenders before they get to the champion. So he's kind of in no man's land if he loses this fight. Super interested in this fight. This is probably the fight that I'm most compelled by on the entire card of UFC 276. So I'm really looking forward to it for the featherweight title. But moving down the card, we have Sean Strickland versus Alex Pereira. This is a great fight. You have Sean Strickland. He's proved himself in the middleweight division, has a win over Jack Hermansson. Split decision, but really it should have been a unanimous decision. He beat up Jack Hermansson, beat Uriah Hall before then. And now, with the lack of contenders at middleweight, this is probably a #1 contender fight. If Sean Strickland is able to beat Alex Pereira, then I believe that Sean Strickland will most likely get the next title shot at middleweight. And if Alex Pereira beats Sean Strickland, he definitely gets the next shot, especially if Israel Adesanya is able to retain his belt against Jared Cannonier at 276, because Alex Pereira has those 2 wins over Israel Adesanya. And, the UFC is putting him against Sean Strickland because they know Sean Strickland is primarily a striker and not a grappler, and they kind of want to fast track Alex Pereira. His last win was against Bruno Silva, who wasn't even ranked. Now he's getting a top 10 guy in Sean Strickland. We can see exactly what the UFC wants to do here. They want to see Alex Pereira get a big win against Sean Strickland and then push him into a title fight against Israel Adesanya because of the lack of contenders, considering Israel Adesanya now has 2 wins over Whitaker, has 2 wins over Marvin Vettori, has the win over Paulo Costa. There's not a lot of options at middleweight after Jared Cannonier. The winner of this fight will get the next shot at the middleweight belt. Moving down the card, Miesha Tate versus Lauren Murphy. Ew. This fight is Miesha Tate coming in, making her flyweight debut, and basically what the UFC wants to happen here is if Miesha Tate is able to get a win over Lauren Murphy, they're going to give Miesha Tate a shot against Valentina Shevchenko. Miesha Tate retired at the end of 2016. She has 1 win against a 40-year-old fighter who retired herself, Mariana Renault. And she most recently got beat by Ketlin Vieira. Lauren Murphy hasn't fought since losing to Valentina Shevchenko. Honestly, this ruins a perfectly good main card for me. So this is kind of a knock on UFC 276. I don't think this should be on the main card. There's so many better fights on UFC 276. I get why they're doing it because Miesha Tate has some name recognition. I don't want to see this fight. I don't care about this fight. I don't want to see Miesha Tate fight Valentina Shevchenko. Lauren Murphy's never going to fight for the belt again. This fight does not compel me at all. And this actually ruins UFC 276 for me a little bit. So I'm going to move on to the next fight. Pedro Munhoz versus Sean O'Malley. Sean O'Malley is finally getting tested against elite level competition. The only good fighter that Sean O'Malley has fought in his UFC career has been Marlon Chito Vera, and we know what happened there. He got his legs chopped, then he got shucked to the ground and brutally flash KO'd and being stretchered out of the cage with no serious injury. Sean O'Malley has won a couple fights since then. Raulian Paiva is a little bit of a step up over like an Eddie Wineland, those types of fights. But it's still not a great win at all. I know people were elevating Raulian Paiva. Not that great of a win. He is now fighting a legit elite level bantamweight in Pedro Munhoz. And if he wins this fight, he's probably going to jump into the top 10, and Sean O'Malley could be 2 fights away from a potential title shot after this, or even 1 fight away. If he beats Pedro Munhoz, there's a chance we see the UFC throw him into a top 5 matchup. Maybe if Marlon Vera beats Dominic Cruz, Marlon Vera could earn that rematch with Sean O'Malley. We could see that rematch for the #1 contender spot. But the bantamweight division is just so logjam. You have Piotr Jan, you have Sterling, Dillashaw, you have Henry Cejudo coming back. You have so many great fighters at bantamweight. It's hard to say who's going to end up getting the next shot. But if Sean O'Malley can beat Pedro Munhoz, I will no longer be a doubter depending on how it happens. Really looking forward to this fight. It's a great stylistic matchup for both guys. Both guys, Sean O'Malley has the length and reach, but Pedro Munhoz is so durable, and he brutally chops the legs of every fighter he fights. He's on a bit of a losing streak, but he beat Frankie Edgar. He was robbed of that decision. He looked very good in the first round against Dominic Cruz, and Dominic Cruz came back to win. So I'm super interested in this fight, and I think this is one of the best matchups on the card, and I'm really looking forward to it. Moving down the card to the prelims, and again, this bout order can change, but this is just how it's currently ranked on Tapology. Brad Riddell versus Jalen Turner. What an amazing fight. Jalen Turner, this is his biggest step up in competition. He looks like an elite lightweight, but it's hard to tell just because he hasn't fought the greatest competition. Brad Riddell returning after being spinning wheel kick KO'd by Rafael Fiziev. Interested to see what happens when he gets back in there. And I just can't wait for this fight. I think it's a very compelling fight. Jalen Turner, super dynamic, has great striking, has decent grappling. Brad Riddell, super durable, has good grappling, has good striking, has good stamina. And I'm really interested in this fight just because it's a massive step up for Jalen Turner. And it's going to be one of those fights where they're fighting to stay into the top 15 because Brad Riddell, I believe he's currently ranked like number 13 or 14 right now. If Jalen Turner wins, he's going to take his spot. Brad Riddell is going to fall out of the rankings and fall back into that 15 to 20 type spot. And it's an interesting matchup. I have no idea how this fight is going to go. As we get closer to the event next week, or probably even the end of this week, I'm going to start breaking out full breakdown and predictions where I watch their most recent fights and then get on here and do a full video prediction. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss those. Moving down the card, I don't want to make this video too long. Robbie Lawler versus Bryan Barberena. Now, this isn't, in a fight that's super relevant at 170 pounds. Neither one of these guys is going to be fighting for a title anytime soon, but Robbie Lawler is always in exciting fights, and he's one of my favorite fighters to watch. Bryan Barberena just had that crazy war with Matt Brown. Robbie Lawler just made Nick Diaz quit in a fight that Nick Diaz shouldn't even been in. I'm just happy to see this fight. I think it's going to be a fan-friendly fight. I think it's going to be a back-and-forth fight. I think it's going to be primarily striking. I think it's going to be both guys looking to take each other's heads off, and I'm super excited for this fight. I'm always happy to see Robbie Lawler fight, and I think either one of these guys can win, and I think they have very similar fight styles, and the fact that this is on the prelims just shows you how good UFC 276 is. Moving down the card, Jessica Eye versus Macy Barber. I don't really care about this fight. Macy Barber claims to be the future. I don't know. I don't really think she is. She has a loss to Roxanne Modafferi, and then she was making excuses after the fact. Jessica Eye is coming in. I think her most recent fight was a loss to Jennifer Maia, so it's kind of do or die for Jessica Eye. It's one of the fights, can the young eat the old here? Can Macy Barber kind of start to make her name again off of Jessica Eye? But I'm not super interested in this fight, so I'm going to move down the card. Ian Gary versus Gabe Green. Ian Gary has a lot of hype around him, and he's talking as if he's Conor McGregor. And this is a decent step up in competition, over Darian Weeks was his last fight, and Jordan Wright before that. And I'm going to be very interested to see how he does against a guy like Gabe Green. And I was actually shocked the UFC made this fight. I thought they would kind of baby Ian Gary a little bit more before they gave him a guy like Gabe Green. But Gabe Green is a legit test for Ian Gary, and I'm curious if he can pass this test. He hasn't looked that great in his first 2 fights. So I'm genuinely curious if he's able to kind of take that subtle step up in competition and keep climbing the ladder within the UFC welterweight division. Really interested in that fight. Moving down the card, Uriah Hall versus Andre Muniz. Andre Muniz, legit top 15 middleweight, great grappler, has the submission win over Jacare Souza. He submitted his last 3 opponents, and this is a nice fight right here. I think this is 2 top 15 ranked guys. Uriah Hall wants to see if he can get back on track. There was so much hype behind Uriah Hall when he came into the UFC off The Ultimate Fighter, and he really has never lived up to that hype. He lost to Sean Strickland in his last fight. The fight before that was when Chris Weidman broke his leg in the first round. Not a real win for him. And the fight before that, he wasn't looking too good against Anderson Silva, and then eventually Anderson Silva, he was able to finish Anderson Silva in the later rounds. That was Anderson Silva's kind of retirement fight from MMA. So Uriah Hall's looking to get back on track. Andre Muniz is looking to make a jump in the rankings. I think Uriah Hall's still in the top 10. Muniz is sitting at that like 14 or 15 spot right now. Great fight. I'm curious. It's kind of a striker versus grappler matchup. Uriah Hall is going to want to strike. Andre Muniz is going to want to take him down and look for the submission. Super interested in this fight because a lot of people think Andre Muniz is the guy to beat Adesanya. I think that talk is far premature, but if he beats Uriah Hall, with the lack of depth in the division, he could be 1 or 2 fights away from a potential title shot, depending on how he gets matched up in his next few fights. Moving down the card, Jim Miller versus Bobby Green. I believe this is on the early prelims. Jim Miller's an absolute legend. Got some big wins in his last 2 fights. Bobby Green had 2 big wins over Ali Quinta and Nasrat Haparas, and then he lost to Islam Makhachev on short notice. So that really isn't a big knock on him. I think this is just another fight where it's 2 guys we're never going to see at the top of the division, but both guys have fan-friendly styles. Jim Miller, this is his last fight on his UFC contract. The UFC didn't want to re-sign him for whatever reason. Maybe if he goes out there and gets a big win over Bobby Green, they could re-sign a legend like Jim Miller. He said he wants to stay all the way to UFC 300 and fight you on UFC 300. But this is just another great fan-friendly fight. Perfect for the prelims, and I actually think it should be on the regular prelims, not the early prelims. Not that it matters, but I guess it should be on ESPN rather than ESPN+. Moving down the card, Brad Tavares versus Dricus du Plessis. I mean, this is a great fight, and for the middleweight division, you have Brad Tavares, who is the gatekeeper of the middleweight division. This guy just fights all the tough up-and-coming middleweights, and Dricus du Plessis, he looks great in his last few fights. He was supposed to fight Chris Curtis, I think, back at UFC 273. Curtis pulled out, then Gastelum was supposed to step in. Gastelum pulled out, so now he was left without a fight, and now he's finally making his way back into action at UFC 276 against Brad Tavares, and Brad Tavares is the measuring stick of the division. You beat Brad Tavares, and you tend to move on to bigger and better things, and I can't wait for this fight. Brad Tavares is always in fun fights, and Dricus du Plessis as well. He's always in fun fights as well, and it's just crazy that these are potential 2 middleweight contenders. Du Plessis could find his way within the top 15 with another win. Maybe after this, he could be fighting a top 15 guy. It's hard to believe this is the second fight on the card. Moving down the card, not the greatest fight on paper. Jessica Rose Clark versus Julia Stolarenko. Not super hyped for this fight. I know a lot of people get behind Jessica Rose Clark because, they think she's attractive or whatever. She's coming off a loss to Stephanie Egger. She has a win over Jocelyn Edwards, which looks good, especially after Jocelyn Edwards' recent win. You look at Julia Stolarenko. She's coming off a loss to Alexis Davis by decision. She's coming off a stoppage loss to Julia Avila. And, I think this is a matchup the UFC made. I think they want to get Jessica Rose Clark back on the winning track. And I think they're just trying to promote her because of her looks. The UFC has been known to do that. They try to find attractive women fighters and they just try to promote them, give them favorable matchups, try to build them up. And I think that's what they're trying to do in this fight. I'm not particularly looking forward to this fight at all. But UFC 276 is just stacked from top to bottom. I mean, so many great fights on the prelims, on the early prelims, on the main card. I cannot wait. 2 title fights. Potential #1 contender fight between Sean Strickland and Alex Pereira. Potential #1 contender fight for Miesha Tate between her and Lauren Murphy. Sean O'Malley's getting tested. So many storylines from this fight. And it's hard to give this fight card a grade because every bone in my body is saying give UFC 276 an A+. But I am not going to give UFC 276 an A+. I am going to give UFC 276 an A. And the reason I'm giving it an A is just because the main event, while it's very compelling, it's not that huge main event that has, like some storyline behind it on top of it being a high level, fight. Like Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen 2 from back in the day, main eventing this card would have been amazing. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor would have been headlining this card with the card intact, would have made this an A+. But I just feel like Israel Adesanya, Jared Cannonier, while it's a great fight, and while I'm super excited for the fight, I just wish it was, had just something else to it. And I wish that it was going to be a little bit more competitive than I think it is. And it's just a stylistic matchup that I think Israel Adesanya should really be able to surpass him. And that's what kind of is a knock on it. And again, there's no real storyline there. And I'm not a guy that cares about storylines too much, but I just feel like to give this an A+, we have to have an A+ main event. And, maybe Adesanya versus Alex Pereira, if he was able to get the win over Sean Strickland. I know that's taken a fight away, but maybe if that was the main event, this would be an A+. But I just have to give it a little bit of a knock because of that. And, maybe if it was just that, I would still give it an A+. But then we got Miesha Tate versus Lauren Murphy on the main card. Ooh. And then also, this isn't really too much of a knock. Jessica Eye, Macy Barber, that's on the prelims. I don't really care too much about that, but I feel like that's just what knocks it down a bit. You have the main event, which I perceive, and a lot of people perceive, to not be super competitive. It's not one of these fights where we're like, oh my God, I have no idea what's going to happen in this fight. And I think that combined with Miesha Tate, Lauren Murphy on the main card, this is a solid A. It's one of the best fight cards ever on paper. And it's almost definitely the best pay-per-view of the year on paper. I know UFC 275 was incredible on paper, wasn't that great, but when it actually happened, it was amazing. But UFC 276, I give it a solid A. Don't forget to comment down below and let me know what grade you would give UFC 276. Also, don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.